Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome everybody to the second day of the conference. We're starting with Iyad Raya with concepts and what's that? What's it actually? $100 as social forms, is that it? Right. Thank you. Take it away.
No, what to do, like make the thought. What have you got?
I'm either going to
Trip.
skip you know.
Got that paper anymore. So I think
Can you unmute yourself, Iyad?
Yes. So
Okay, thank you. Not working.
yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Oh, is it the wrong? Sorry, I plugged you into the wrong room.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry.
We can do both talks at once.
Yes.
I'm basically making fucking everything up.
No, it's fine.
Well, I think it's all set now. Sorry,
Hello.
first day working on this. Yeah. Yeah,
Yes. So is it set up?
yeah, it's set up now.
Okay. Should I start then?
Yeah, please.
Okay, cool. I'm not gonna have a presentation per se, but I will share just for a minute the kind of the outline. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so just this is what I will discuss. Basically, it's two parts. The first part I will posit the problem in kind of in general, in a philosophical form, if you want, and then I will zoom in the second part. And the problem is, or the approach is, in a way, systematically think of Marx, if you want, in a loose analogy with Sellars, as the thinker of conation, Sellars being a thinker of cognition in the sense of having systematically approach cognition. And so this is the kind of, not a strict analogy, but the parallel there. So at first, in this first part, I will try to express this as a problem of how one thinks of action and consequence, or the intended and the unintended. But then I zoom in, and then I, in the second part, think about how Marx thinks about value and money, and I will go through these three sections: the unity of concepts and practices, as the Pittsburgh school articulated, and then I will contrast it and try to use it to model the money abstract labor relation. But it will not be a strict analogy, and we will have to consider third unity, which is the money form money. And in the end, in the last section, is just like a bit programmatic. So that's the sketch. I will just stop this because I have to read from the paper. Okay, so I will start reading. So, okay, so first, the entwinement of the intended and the unintended. That the gap between intended actions and unintended consequences has significance is a modern platitude. Hegel, Brandom tells us, marked the distinction in terms of Handlung and Tat, action and deed. Moderns allegedly, that is ideologically, hold each other accountable only to the extent of their respective knowledge. The unintended is no one's responsibility. This gap was brought to a religious height a few decades before in Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. Let each look after themselves and only themselves, and abundance will be the destiny of each and everyone. Implicitly addressing himself to the sovereign, Smith suggests that the sovereign's responsibility is to abstain from meddling in the wondrous workings of a laissez-faire market. Let nature do its work. Smith was more concerned, of course, about his compatriots than his successors. If the market is to be left to its own accord, its side effects are to be palliated. When Hegel finally wrote his Philosophy of Right, the awareness of the corrosive power of the unsocial sociability of civil society led him to seek the re-embedding of economic logic in the logic of the state. It is state law, expressed in the monarch form, and not market law, expressed in the money form, that realizes concrete freedom. Marx rejected both the possibility and desirability of Hegel's image. As for Smith's image, he in part conceded. Some sort of invisible hand is indeed at work, but he refused to end the inquiry. If unintended, this peculiar process is nevertheless intelligible. One familiar reading of Marx's effort is straightforward but deeply problematic. The invisible hand is the law of value. It operates behind the back of practitioners, but unlike Smith's harmonious summit, the final stage of equilibrium, the law of value is self-contradictory. It undermines itself as it further develops, culminating not in harmony but dissolution. All sorts of accusations have been leveled justly against this reading. It has been called technicist, deterministic, economistic, teleological, etc. But a counter-reading, despite much efforts, is forthcoming. In the counter-reading, the intelligibility of this peculiar process is predicated on accounting for the realm of appearances. In the language used here, accounting for intended actions. For this reading to take off, the intentional has to be treated not as a veil behind which a true reality reveals itself to the scientist, but the key to this reality. The index for this reading is the subjective-objective character of Marx's theory. But how different is this accounting for the intentional from Smith's image? Smith begins with very intentional individual indeed, who through their aggregate actions bring about a dynamic that goes beyond the knowledge and will of each and all. If Marx is remembered for anything, it is his rejection of methodological individualism. When commenting on the inference to the invisible hand in the Grundrisse, Marx notes that beginning with individual producers pursuing their ends equally licenses an inference to the prosperity to all and to total destruction. What the political economists fail to understand is the intrinsic relation between private and general interest. The relation between the intended and the unintended is not fortuitous, but structural. It's not extrinsic, but intrinsic. Smith, to be sure, saw necessity, but only because his very intentional individual is a homo economicus, guaranteed to evermore seek gain. Marx, on the other hand, could not see the connection mechanically, for neither of the terms, i.e. the intentional individual and the unintended process, is intelligible without the other. In the beginning, there was not desire, but a historically definite form of social interdependence. However deep one traces back into history, and indeed prehistory, communality is an inescapable presupposition. The human animal, like many other animals, from ants to wolves, is constitutionally communal. The social metabolism of production and consumption is necessarily cooperative. What changes is the form of cooperation. This does not mean, of course, that all there is to human sociality is cooperation, but only that an account of human sociality, let alone of production and consumption, that fails to articulate the moment of cooperation necessarily lying therein is destined to distort it. In a society where wealth appears as a mass of commodities, that is, where producers are separated from their means of production, competition and cooperation converge. cooperation takes the form of competition. The Homo economicus of Adam Smith is for Marx a social form of being. His rationality is socio-historically constituted. It is important here to bring some precision regarding the content of the Homo economicus. For Smith, this is a prudent figure, balancing his passions by letting one propensity, the propensity to barter, to rule supreme. Unlike the wild passions, whose demands for immediate gratification potentially jeopardize the agent, the unfettering of the prosperity to barter centers interest, the cold-blooded, calculating, gain-seeking motivation, at the heart of human behavior. The notion of interest, as Albert Hirschman tells the story, gained currency as a positive, respectable motivation with the rise of capitalism. The behavior corresponding to this acting from interest, which was observed and valorized, is trading, i.e. money-making. Money is the objective form of postponed gratification. Money-making, the objective form of prudence. The Homo economicus was inferred then from money-making behavior. Marx's objection is not simply to reverse causation, namely to understand the Homo economicus as a product of conditions wherein accessing means of subsistence and power requires the medium of money. Marx exits empiricism by recasting the relation synchronically. However those conditions historically came about, once in place, the Homo economicus and monetary exchange are two sides of the same coin. Both classical political economy and neoclassical economics fail to articulate the intrinsic connection between the Homo economicus and monetary exchange. As a result, value, which is taken to lie in the individual, is severed from money and studied in abstraction therefrom. Both the classical labor theory of value and neoclassical marginalist theory of value are, in the word of Hans-Georg Backhaus, pre-monetarist. While usually contrasted as an objective versus subjective theory of value, they are both, however, in the last instance, objectivist, to the extent that the Homo economicus, whether merely an empirical generalization, as in Adam Smith, or a theoretical model, as in neoclassicals, is a postulate of a theory whose valuations, namely the agents, are calculable by the theorist. The difference lies rather in ontology, substance-based in the case of labor, relation-based in the case of marginal utility. In both, the Homo economicus is understood independently of his socio-historical constitution. Marx, on the other hand, understands money as the necessary form of appearance of value. I'm suggesting, but only suggesting for the time being, that the key to articulate Marx's counter-image of the entwinement of the intended and the unintended lies in his articulation of the relation between value and money. But as may be familiar to you from the extensive Marxist literature, explicating this relation is riven with difficulties, leading to contrasting, indeed opposing readings of Capital, the book. What I will do in the rest is to zoom in on this relation, armed with certain Sellarsian conceptual tools, only to thereafter philosophically appropriate the lesson, as it were, by returning very briefly to Sellars himself. So now I will focus on the relation between value and money. So first, what is so enigmatic about the relation between money and value? I will not have the time for proper literature review, so I will suffice myself with some caricatures. First of all, though money is the necessary form of value, it is abstract labor that produces value. It is open to the theorist then, like Moshe Postone, to historically confine the necessity of money as form of value to the stage of the emergence of capital as a totalizing social process. But money, Marx writes in the contribution, is the immediate form of existence of labor. The connection seems structural. This may make it seem, however, like value itself is a redundant notion. This is the position of some economically leaning theorists. I have in mind Robert Brenner. The same has been said about abstract labor, for if value only is in the community of a commodity with another, as Michael Heinrich tirelessly emphasizes, it may appear that abstract labor is a confused notion. This was Alfred Zonreitel's position. Articulating this tripartite structure proved challenging then. All of the above were criticized for their partial appropriation of Marx, but their divergences index a problem. The problem of articulating the tripartite structure of labor, value, and money explodes in the so-called transformation problem, namely the transformation of value to price. Let's immediately ask then, does abstract labor transform into money, and if so, how? I'll approach this question by first considering the unity of concepts and practices, then modeling the relation between or of money to labor based on this unity, only to finally consider a third unity, that of money, form, and money, which has no analog in concepts and which is necessary to articulate and differentiate the peculiar unity of abstract labor and money. I want to draw an analogy between the relation, but also to catch the difference. And this matters in the critical appraisal of, say, Brandom. The intuitive image of this transformation is empiricist. It mirrors the abstractive theory of concept formation, of given particulars that by an operation of a mind are abstracted into universals. Instead of perceptual particulars, value is treated as given. What the Pittsburgh school compellingly argue is that the process of concept formation is not mental abstraction, but social practice. Concepts are not first psychologically formed, only to be thereafter used in practice. Concepts are rather formed in use. On the Brandomian view, Sellars is more complicated. Concepts are formed by material inferences. Inferences are acts that connect and disconnect contents. Those contents, in turn, are formed by those very acts. The act-content duality forms a unity. Thus, conceptual contents are not repositories of empirical contents, but forms of practice. Furthermore, one cannot peel off conceptual contents to uncover the underlying practices. Practices are practices only to the extent that they are formed. Instead of processual image of non-conceptual abstracting and abstracted concepts, mental for empiricists, practical for some pragmatists, we have a theory of conceptualization of the movement of the notion in Hegel's terms. The challenge for materialists is to undermine this unity without regressing to empiricism or pragmatism. The wager of materialists is that there are social forms of practice that, though have affinity to concepts, are not, however, conceptual. To avoid the transformation problem as sketched above, I'll argue next that the relation of abstract labor to money should be understood as that of abstracting to abstracted, as two sides of the same abstraction. So now I move into the second unity, the money, abstract labor. Let us consider abstract labor first. There are two dimensions here, one qualitative and one quantitative. Qualitatively, abstract labor denotes labor qua labor, i.e. the validation of labor as labor. Quantitatively, it is socially necessary labor time, a quantum that cannot be ex ante measured, for it depends on labor validation, which in turn happens by exchanging. We need to pay attention to this notion of validity used by Marx, Geltung, which Helmut Reichelt recently emphasized. And it will be useful to contrast it with recognition. Recognition has a cognitive and a conative sense. Cognitively, it involves classification, considering something as thus and so. Conatively, if that's a word, it is the taking of a certain attitude towards that which is recognized by unfolding the normative implications. Validation, on the other hand, appears to belong to conation. It is mere affirmation. In a sense, it is the analog of intuitive registering in cognition as understood by Sellars. Brandom is not happy with Sellars' intuition, nor would he be happy with validation. Brandom's theory of the implicit grasp of a concept in practice licenses both implicit understanding and implicit recognition. Were we to concede to Brandom, what would be implicitly grasped in exchange? Presumably, it would be the recognition of labor as a producer of used values. But if the recognition of another is the recognition as one of us, the implicit recognition of another's labor is merely the recognition that it is useful to me. There is no us dimension. This is because there's no macroeconomics to the recognition of labor. The concept of total social labor is out of view, but only microeconomics of dyadic exchanges. The validation of labor Marx invokes is the validation of private labor as part of total social labor, the validation of private labor as social. But it involves no classification. It is the making social of private labor. It need not be apperceived, indeed cannot. And it cannot because that would involve the quantitative dimension, i.e. determining the proportions of socially necessary labor time for social reproduction, which is impossible in an exchange-constituted economy. As Adorno says, the social totality cannot be rendered intelligible, but only the law of autonomization. The recognition of labor as a producer of use value remains a private affair. Total social labor, on the other hand, is no one's concept, implicit or explicit. It is not a telos. Total social labor obtains haphazardly, which does not mean accidentally. This would regress us back to the invisible hand, but non-systematically, meaning that the social dynamic does not ensure or seek to ensure its obtainment. It has the status between contingency and necessity because indeed the microeconomics of dyadic exchanges validates labor. Had it not, the possibility of obtaining total social labor of the socially necessary labor for the reproduction of society would be forsaken. In Marxian terms, the mute compulsion of the economic process perpetually distributes and redistributes labor in the different sectors of production. In Marx's own words, the constant tendency, this is the quote, the constant tendency to equilibrium of the various spheres of production is exercised only in the shape of a reaction against the constant upsetting of this equilibrium. End of quote. But if we want to avoid reifying this process into an abstract principle and thus falling back into objectivism, we need to articulate the relation between the overt and the covert, the intended and the unintended. There is a concept-like form which is in some capacity grasped and which would seem to fill this lacuna. This form is money. The monetary system supervenes over total social labor, i.e. mediates the socially necessary labor for reproduction via labor distribution. It glues the dyads of exchanges together, and thus also to the extent that labor power is a commodity, the spheres of production and exchange. But the social implications of money are not written on its forehead, as it were. In using money, one may be implicitly, in Brandon's sense, recognizing particular labor. But the gap between money use, the action, and its consequences, the deed, goes beyond Brandon's theorizing of the circle of saying and doing. To see why this is the case, we need to hone in on money. This would allow us to grasp at once the affinity and antipathy of concepts and monies, and thus to finally leave the latter behind by distinguishing the unity of abstract labor, money, from the unity of concepts, practices. So I used this analogy to think this act-content relation to think about the relation between abstract labor to money as abstracting to abstracted, but it's not equivalent because it's not a relation between practices and concepts because money is different, and now the point is to bring out this difference. So money form and money. Money is a form of practice, but it is also a thing. Failing to consistently uphold this duality, Marx tells us, leads to symbolism or fetishism, respectively. What does it mean for a social form, social relation to be thingified, to have an empirical form? Let's consider the objectification of concepts first. Concepts are inscribed in things and patterns of behavior. They are ways of being of things, artifacts, and ways of behavior, practices. As for the signs that carry those functions, They have their own empirical forms to which concepts are irreducible, for concepts are not icons. Their being, as it were, lies in sign relations, enacted in social practices. There's a discrepancy between a concept's relation to its sign bearer and money's relation to its body bearer that I will now seek to elucidate. Though Marx is adamant to distinguish the money form from money, accusing virtually everyone of failing to draw the distinction, the lesson is not merely analytic. The lesson is rather that money is a social form which objectively appears as a thing. But what is so special about this thingification of social relations? Don't flags, for instance, also follow this pattern? Doesn't the material use of flags coincide with their formal use, just like how the use value of money is nothing but its exchangeability, as Georgi Marcos quips? This is the symbolic temptation, namely to consider the thing a mere symbol of social relations, intelligible in abstraction from their symbolizations. Flags are artistic products. In Kant's sense, money is not. The money form does not precede, logically speaking, its body. The analogy that could help us is with organisms, particularly as conceived by Kant. For as we shall see, the famous as-if form of objectivity is crucial to elucidate the status of money, albeit not entirely in a Kantian fashion. We will not really see, but this would have taken the discussion into this technical apparatus of Sellars' metalinguistic analysis of meaning, which I will not present, but we can talk about it. For Kant, the form of organism is a natural purpose because it does not lie in an intellect that first conceives of it, but is out there. The relation between form and matter is intrinsic. We perceive cows as cows, that is, as organisms rather than as mechanical machines, because the form is irreducible to the parts. The form is effective. But Kant did not grant organisms equal standing as the other objects of empirical experience. The judgments pertaining to organisms are reflective, not determined. We have to proceed as if there are organisms, but we cannot have theoretical knowledge thereof, for that requires knowledge claims about a suprasensuous world which Kant forbids. Likewise, the money form is not a product of an intellect. It is not an organism either, however. The form and matter of an organism are intrinsically related, such that it constitutes a singularity. The species is a mental abstraction. There's no difference, on the other hand, between the money form as species, the generality moment, and the money form as proper name, the singularity moment. The money form is both ambivalent and tethered to particular bodies. Its generality is akin to concepts which are likewise ambivalent to their sign bearers. But in being at once tethered to particular bodies, it is as if the species itself exists, Marx says of money. Why is this true of money and not of concepts? Concepts do not converge with the empirical forms of their sign bearers. The level of natural linguistic objects is always already abstracted when we use concepts. This real abstracting is psychological, and it is the only one to be conceded to empiricists. However, as a psychological abstracting, contra empiricist, it is not semantic, i.e. the extraction of universal from given particulars, but very much in Zon-Ratel's sense, practical, the necessary bracketing out of a certain aspect to make room for another. Money, on the other hand, involves no such abstracting. It is a sensuous, suprasensuous thing. For this reason, it appears as if the money form is a concept in itself, a concrete universal. At once, it transcends its particular tokenings, but lies not in a mind, but out there. It is both immanent and transcendent. Money is not without its particular empirical form, but is irreducible thereto. The difference between concepts and monies is then a difference of social being, of ways of being socially spread. Ray Brassier succinctly encapsulates this difference as follows. where the unity, so a quote from Ray, where the unity of thought abstractions defies spatiotemporal localization, because it is that of transcendent generality, the unity of real abstractions defies localization because it is spread out across space and time, end quote. We need to articulate this contrast between mental and real abstraction in terms of the difference between the sociality of concepts and the sociality of monies. The spatiotemporality of concept use is a function of recognitive sociality, of Brandam's normative sanctioning, which is a regulative ideal, we should add. The spatiotemporality of money use is a function of actual, validative, also if that's a word, of validative sociality, of material sanctioning. But this material sanctioning is mediated. It is mediated by money. Money use involves the inferential capacities characteristic of human intentionality. But as a congealed form thing, which only is in being socially spread, money is not only genetically social, as concepts are, but operationally social. It is an as-if concept which can only be used in communication across a whole society. In which case, no explication a la Brandam would track either presuppositions or implications. So concepts are suprasensuous. Their actuality does not entail their existence. They are realized in practice. Monies are sensuous suprasensuous. Their actuality is predicated on their existence. But their actuality is not simply their existence. This is the temptation of money fetishism. Money's actuality lies in the opaque social process subtending it, the validation of labor as part of total social labor. So I'm now, in one paragraph, I will just try to conclude all of this together and then programmatically, very briefly move to Sellars. Marx's real abstracting captures the cooperative material underbelly of competitive capitalist society, which is at once involuntary due to the separation of producers from means of production and intentional through buying and selling. It is the sundering of freedom and intentionality that moves Marx from political economy to the critique of political economy. It is what allows him to think the intrinsic relation between the intentional and the unintentional, of analyzing the form of intentionality, namely the homo economicus, rather than positing it as original. Had prices exhibited regularity, the duality of value and price would have been redundant. But the irregularity of prices, and thus the duality of value and price, Marx argues, is necessary of capitalism. Correspondingly, we can ask, what is Marx's attitude towards the duality of reasons and causes? So this is, Had reasons explained behavior, the duality of reasons and causes would have been redundant. The aporia of reasons and causes is real, but it is historically circumscribed. It is the analog of the price-value duality as registered in self-consciousness, in philosophy. It is alienation. For Marx, reconciling reasons and causes is not the work of philosophy, nor is it for Sellars, but of social revolution. It is what moves us from the real tension of leading a double life, of inhabiting the material world under the imperative of self-preservation, as the scientific image confirms, and inhabiting the spiritual world under the imperatives of reified, inconsequential, and for this reason ideological, ethical ideals, as the manifest image expresses and conceals. That is, moving from the duality of man in the world to man of the world, where the one world that is our world, to the extent that this is a quote from Sellars, we directly relate the world as conceived by scientific theory to our purposes, as Sellars projects. This expresses neither a romantic metaphysical convergence, nor indeed a total domination of nature, but the withering away of the duality as a problem of thought. That there is an irreducible gap between concepts and intuitions, actions and consequences, is at the heart of the modern self-awareness of infinity as the perpetual overcoming of finitude. But this gap expresses a crisis in reality and an aporia in thought where self-determination is blocked. This is how I think a materialist diagnostic approach to the so-called left and right Sellarsian divide would proceed. It promises no therapy a la McDowell. Sellars insists on uncovering the material underbelly of concepts, the signs, for his theory of picturing. This theory forbids a premature quasi-Hegelian closure of the duality of the manifest and the scientific images of man in the world. Marx insists on uncovering the material underbelly of monies, the things, for his theory of abstracting. This theory forbids the premature quasi-Hegelian closure of the duality of the rational and the real, where picturing is a postulate for a theory of inhuman truth. Abstracting is a postulate for a theory of the social good. Yeah, that's it.
Many thanks for that, Iyad. Are you listening well? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
We have time for a couple of questions from the audience, perhaps. Does anyone have a question? Yeah.
So thank you. You said in between that money is the concepts are only genealogy social, whereas money is operationally social.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering like what the resistance or what hinders us from like not making that distinction and saying that concepts might also be operationally social. What's the difference?
The difference being that, I mean, concept use is very much possible in ratiocination, or I don't know how to pronounce this word, meaning that you could think on your own. It's as if you were able to think, you were only able to think in communicating with another, and not just another, but the whole society. So it's as if only when you can use concept only when somehow all of society is at once making use of these concepts. So this is what I meant by genetically social and versus operationally social. So this is like a difference in social ontology in this sense. When because this is a thing that is one and many at once, money, that is your money in your pocket is just is not real in this sense, because it's connected with all the monies in everyone's pockets, and only in that connection is the thing in your pocket and money. That's not the same with concepts. You would be perfectly a rational being using concepts if you were put on an island right now alone, and you could make use of these concepts to operate as if you were, well, not as if we were in society, but you can make use of these concepts to inform your behavior. I don't know if that helps.
I have another one. Just a second, Iyad. Yeah. Was it? I haven't seen it. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, actually, it's a follow-up from the first one. I think I'm with you in distinguishing money from concepts, but I'm not sure I see the distinction like you do. For instance, you say that you can use concepts alone in an island, like Robinson Crusoe, something like that. That is not really Brandomian or Sellarsian or even Wittgensteinian.
But just to clarify, if we throw you now into an island,
yeah, sure.
yeah.
But it's the same. I mean, the basic idea of reciprocal recognition, as far as I understand it, is just that you cannot apply norms alone. Even if you try, I mean, even if you you think you have some criteria for applying it, the objectivity of the norms depends on the fact that those criteria are evaluated from another perspective.
But I think, sorry, yeah, but just to clarify, I think that's pretty, you know, pretty fine for you to internalize the sociality to be your own judge as well.
Oh, but then you are Kantian, non-Hegelian.
Yeah, but the difference here is about the whether it could have emerged in this way, and whether now, once you're socially initiated as a product of this socio-historical process, which involved many, as in many people, and if you're now put on an island, I think you're pretty much, you've internalized sociality, and you can have you have society in your mind, I think, in that sense. You have all that is required, even on Sellars or on Brandom's, to operate rationally. I don't see what's preventing this you from taking the other perspective to criticize yourself.
Thanks.
Any more questions? Nope. Maybe from the online participants? Nope. Oh, okay, thank you, Iyad, then. I think that's it. Okay. Many thanks.
Thank you for listening.
There's one question.